Well, welcome to Bible study once again. My name is John Robbins. I'm one of the pastors on staff here at Pulaski Heights United Methodist Church. I'm certainly grateful every week that you would be a part of this special Bible study. It is special because it's not face-to-face. I have to look into a camera every week and hope that it is meaningful for you on the other side of the camera and that it's beneficial to your walk with Christ. But I'm certainly thankful once again for your presence. We continue our study tonight. In just a moment, we're going to begin with the 7th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, beginning with verse 24. But I want to talk just for a moment about what we dealt with last week, and then we'll move right along. Last week, we dealt with the one miracle that is found in all four Gospels, that is the feeding of the 5,000. The disciples come to Jesus and say, you need to have these people dispersed. They need to leave to go home or to some other place to find something to eat. And Jesus then tells the disciples, no, you're going to feed them. Jesus has them lay down on the green grass. It is one of those visible kinds of statements from Mark himself about who Jesus is. Because when we look at Psalm 23, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. It is one of the ways in which Mark, in a very subtle kind of way, reminds us of who Jesus is. He is God. So after the feeding of the 5,000, we recognize that none of those people make any kind of overture toward Jesus or the disciples themselves regarding whether or not they had any idea that the miraculous had taken place. But then the miraculous does take place once again after the feeding of the 5,000 as Jesus comes toward the disciples who are in a boat. He's walking on the water. His intent was to pass by them. We made reference to a passage of Scripture in the book of Exodus last week of how God passes by Moses, showing God's glory, defining who God is. And once again, it's Mark's way of telling us that we see Jesus showing God's glory because he was going to pass by the disciples. He does not pass by them, and the seas are calmed, and once again, the disciples do not understand the miraculous. And we're going to see that they didn't understand the feeding of the 5,000 either. So one miracle after another that Jesus performs fall at the feet of the disciples as if it were nothing. They don't understand. Then they are questioned, that is, Jesus is questioned regarding why he and the disciples have not washed their hands before a meal. They're not unsanitary. It has to do with the ritual that has been stretched or perverted beyond its original intent. And now it has not become a tradition of God. It has become a human tradition, not a mandate or a law from God, but something that humanity has stretched beyond its original intent. And so Jesus reminds the disciples, quit worrying about how we wash our hands. You don't do what you need to do anyway with regard to your parents. You have taken a human tradition and stretched it beyond any purpose or intent. In that many times these respective Pharisees and others would take money that they were to use to honor their father and mother to care for their parents, and they would use it as an offering to God. And Jesus said, you're neglecting the fifth commandment in the process of giving an offering to God. It is an offering that is defiled if you give it to God when its intent was to care for your parents. As you can imagine, that's not going to sit well with several of those who are out to get Jesus anyway. So now we want to look at an interesting story that we find in the 7th chapter of Mark's Gospel. We're going to begin with verse 24, where we left off last week. Now let me preface what we are about to read by saying it looks as though Jesus is extraordinarily rude to this woman. And yet it's not that at all. We're going to see that it's much different. In Matthew's account, Jesus is even ruder, if you will, than he is in Mark's account in the same story. So let's look at chapter 7, beginning with verse 24. From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. Jesus entered a house and did not want anyone to know that he was there. Now we know oftentimes Jesus' intent is to go off by himself, not to have others know where he is so that he can be refreshed and renewed, and more often than not, that does not work for him. But it doesn't work again, despite Jesus' efforts. It says, yet he could not escape notice, but a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit, immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. So let's set the scene. Jesus has gone to a house. He wants to go unnoticed. He wants to be able to just do what he needs to do to refresh himself, and yet he is noticed, and there is a woman who comes to him. She wants Jesus to do something about her daughter who is possessed with an unclean spirit. Now remember, in Jesus' day and time, unclean spirits were attributed to any kind of condition that someone might have. And we don't know what this young girl's situation was, but nevertheless, she is tormented, and her mother wants her to be made well, so she comes before Jesus. Now, here's what's interesting. Mark tells us specifically about this woman. Remember, she bows down at his feet, a sign of reverence and respect. And in verse 26, now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. That means she is a Greek-speaking Gentile. She is a non-Jew. She is someone who would not have been able to associate with Jews. Jews would not have associated with her. But she comes into the presence of Jesus, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Now, this is where the story gets rather unusual. And we need to dissect this, if we will, or to use a big seminary word, to do exegetical work. To exegete a text is to dig below the surface and find meaning beneath the surface. So we're going to do exegetical work here. Now, this woman comes into the presence of Jesus. Her daughter is tormented, and she wants Jesus to make her daughter well. She begs him to cast the demon out. She is a Gentile, a non-Jew. So he said to her, verse 27, let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Now, what in the world does that mean? The children here represent the people of Israel. So when Jesus says, let the children be fed first, what Jesus means is, I've come to take care of my people, the Israelites. It's my job to feed them, to care for them. You're a Gentile. You're of Syrophoenician descent. What Jesus is saying is that I don't have time for you. You're not one of us. It seems extraordinarily rude. It seems hateful. And then he says, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Now, let me tell you what that means. The dogs represent the Gentiles. The children represent the Jews. The dogs represent the Gentiles. Jews oftentimes use slang for people who are different from them. And they use slang in reference to Gentiles, often referring to them as dogs. We do that with people in the North. We'll say, those Yankees up there. We'll talk about people in the South, those rednecks down there. We use slang to identify a group of people. It's not always done in love by any stretch of the imagination. And so Jesus says, as this woman comes into his presence, begging for him to heal her daughter, Jesus says, I've come from the people of Israel. That's who I've come for. I haven't come for the dogs. I haven't come for the Gentiles. Well, what kind of Messiah or Savior is that all about? Now remember what happens here. But she answered him, Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. So she fires back. In Mark's gospel, salvation comes to the Jews first. So Jesus seems to put his emphasis on his responsibilities to his Jewish brothers and sisters first. But notice what she says. Jesus says, we throw the food to the dogs. And she says, even dogs get the crumbs under the table. So the woman responds to Jesus by saying, well, if you call us dogs, that's fine, but even dogs get the crumbs. We get something. There's something that I get out of this, and what I want out of this is for my daughter to be made well. Now, Jesus says, for saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Now, let me tell you what this story is really all about, because it's unusual, it's odd, it's upsetting at some level with regard to how Jesus appears to handle this woman and the way he seems to treat her, seems to fly in the face of the loving, caring, compassionate Messiah that we know. What Jesus is doing is testing this woman to see the persistence of her faith. Here is a woman who comes in the presence of Jesus, make my daughter well. And Jesus puts her to the test. He puts the onus on her. Remember how Jesus put the onus on the disciples in the feeding of the 5,000? They say, Jesus, tell them to leave. No, you feed them. Now Jesus puts the responsibility on this mother. Let's find out if she really is willing to do whatever is necessary to make her daughter well. So Jesus says to her, I don't have time for people like you. It's an obstacle that Jesus intentionally puts in her way to see if she's going to overcome that obstacle and keep pressuring him to do what he needs to do. Then he calls her a dog. He uses slang for her, and she fires back. That obstacle is nothing for her. She said dogs even get the crumbs, and I want what's coming to me, and what's coming to me is for you to make my daughter well. And Jesus suddenly becomes smitten with her. She has overcome the obstacles that he put in her way. She has shown her persistence in wanting him to do what she wants him to do, make her daughter well. And Jesus is so smitten with her that he says, when you get home, your daughter is going to be made well. She refers to him in an interesting way. She says, Sir. That is the only time Jesus is referred to as Sir in the Gospel of Mark. And this is the only time in the Gospel of Mark that we see Jesus heal from a distance. Jesus tells the mother, having been smitten with her response and her persistence and faith. Now remember, she's a Gentile. She's on the outside, but she knows who Jesus is and what Jesus can do, and she keeps pushing and pushing and pushing till she gets her way with Jesus. He's put obstacles in her way. I'm going to find out whether or not she really wants her daughter to be made well. She pushes those obstacles aside. Jesus is smitten with the fact that she is that persistent in her faith and understanding of who he is. And as a result, Jesus says, by the time you get home, you're going to discover your daughter is made well. It shows, once again, that Jesus has this capacity to heal people who are not even physically in his presence. But it is the only time in the Gospel of Mark that we see that take place. So what we discover is that Jesus is not being rude to her or mean to her. On the contrary, he has simply put her to the test, and she has passed with flying colors, and because she has, Jesus does exactly what she wants, and her daughter is made well. So Jesus comes not only to the Jews, but he comes to the Gentiles as well. He comes to everybody. Then he returned from the region of Tyre, verse 31, and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. Now, what I want you to see here is that it is not the deaf man that is asking to be made well. It is they who are asking that he be made well. Family, friends, whomever it may be. He is deaf, which means, of course, that he would have a hard time speaking. He has a speech impediment. He's hard to understand, and at the same time, he cannot hear. Now, Jesus does something different. He has just healed somebody who's not even close by. And this time, he took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. So Jesus uses what he has in his arsenal to bring about healing. He speaks healing, he uses his own spittle, he uses the touch, he uses what he can to bring about healing, touching the man's ears, touching his tongue, which means that the man is going to be able to hear and the man is going to be able to speak clearly. And in verse 35, immediately his ears were opened and his tongue was released and he spoke plainly. Now, this miracle Jesus performs in private. There's nobody else around. Jesus and this deaf man have been placed somewhere else by Jesus without the crowd around, without people witnessing what is taking place. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." Remember, the prophet Isaiah said there is one who is coming one day who would cause the lame to walk and the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Interestingly enough, that's Jesus. Now, Jesus does what he needs to do for this man he's made well, and Jesus wants the miracle to speak for itself. There's no explanation necessary. If you know a man is deaf and he's unable to speak clearly, and he goes off with another man for a few minutes and he comes back and he can hear and speak plainly, then you know something miraculous has taken place. And Jesus does not want other people speaking on his behalf yet, and so it is not time for that. So Jesus asked those who have seen what has taken place, not firsthand, but have seen the results of that, to be quiet. But of course, they refuse to be quiet. Mark says they are astounded beyond measure at what Jesus has done. Now we're going to see in chapter 8 the feeding of the 4,000. This miracle is only found in Mark and in Matthew. So Luke and John, neither one record this story in their respective gospels. So let's read another example of Jesus feeding a group of people. In chapter 8, verse 1, "In those days, when there was again a great crowd without anything to eat, he called his disciples and he said to them, 'I have compassion for the crowd because they have been with me now for 3 days and have had nothing to eat.'" Jesus shows compassion for the crowd. Remember, last time the disciples are the ones who showed concern for the crowd. This time Jesus has compassion and says, "These people have been listening to me for 3 days. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance." His disciples replied, "How can one feed these people with bread here in the desert?" Now that is a silly question to ask, since Jesus has already fed people, 5,000 of them, with a handful of loaves of bread. But nevertheless, because the disciples didn't understand, they ask again, "How are you going to pull this one off, Jesus?" He asked them, "How many loaves do you have?" And they said 7. Then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the grove, and he took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute, and they distributed them to the crowd. Now notice this one. In this situation, Jesus is the one who initiated discussion about the hungry people, not the disciples who initiated the discussion previously. They also had a few small fish, and after blessing them, he ordered that these too be distributed. They ate and were filled, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. Now there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away, and immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmathuna. Now look at this. I want to talk about it just for a moment. The feeding of the 5,000 with loaves and fish, and once again there are 7 baskets full left over on this occasion, 12 in the feeding of the 5,000, 7 in the feeding of the 4,000. Now remember, 7 is a holy number. North, south, east, and west, the 4 corners of the earth, and the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. 3 plus 4 equals 7. 7 is a sacred and holy number. It's a complete number. How many days are there in a week? There are 7 days in a complete week. 7 is a holy and complete number. What this tells us in this miracle is that Jesus has done the complete for these people. And it is an overflow. It is an excess once again. It is an abundance that Jesus has provided. Everybody's had their fill, and there's still plenty left over. That's what grace is all about. Everybody has their fill of it, and there's still more to come. There's still more that is available. Once again, it's a story about Jesus taking on the responsibility of emptying himself with the miraculous for the sake of other people and their needs. Jesus is always about giving of himself to an excess, to an overflow, so that the needs are met and still there's more available. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, asking him for a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit. Now, interesting to discover. Jesus' authority comes from God. Notice that the Pharisees came and began to argue with him, asking him for a sign from heaven. In other words, they want evidence that Jesus' authority comes from God to test him, and he sighed deeply. Jesus seems to be responding here with intense prayer in preparation for healing, because look at this. And he said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, and getting into the boat again, he went across to the other side. Jesus says, you always want a sign. A sign, Jesus has, in many different ways, we would think by now, proven with one sign after another that he can do the miraculous, that he is not the average human being. In fact, in the Gospel of John, signs are the word that John uses to refer to miracles, an indication of who Jesus is, a sign of who Jesus is. The Pharisees want Jesus to jump through a hoop. They want him to do something. They want him to move a mountain, empty a sea, prove to us you are who you say you are. Jesus essentially says to them, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do because I am who I am supposed to be. In verse 14, now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they only had one loaf with them in the boat. Now they're in the boat with Jesus. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. They said to one another, is it because we have no bread? So Jesus uses a metaphor, yeast, to describe the Pharisees and Herod, and the disciples have no earthly idea what he's talking about. They think he's talking about the fact that they haven't brought bread with them. But this is, we're going to see, is an emphatic warning from Jesus. What does he mean by the yeast of the Pharisees? Mark doesn't say what the yeast of the Pharisees is. So we have to look at other Gospels to try to make a determination about what Jesus might mean by that, because Mark does not tell us. In Matthew's Gospel, the yeast of the Pharisees that Jesus says be aware of is the Pharisees' teaching. In Luke's Gospel, it is the Pharisees' hypocrisy. So in Mark's Gospel, most likely it deals with the blindness that people experience in understanding who Jesus is. Jesus says, beware of those people who are blind to who I am. Ironically, he's speaking to the very people who are blind to who he is so often. In verse 17, and becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? A hardened heart means that one turns away from the truth. Jesus is incredibly frustrated with the disciples. I want you to see that. They don't get it. One miracle after another they've witnessed, one teaching after another they've heard, one sermon after another they've been a part of, and they don't know who Jesus is. Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 7. Then he said to them, do you not yet understand? It is a dramatic statement from Jesus. I'm not an actor. I wish I could find a way to be like Cary Grant and to say something in such a profound and cool and awesome way that you get the point here. But the point is, Jesus is incredibly frustrated. He is surrounded by people who lack faith, and it is going to take its toll on him. I want you to see that. We're about to enter into a story that's very interesting, a story about how this takes a toll on Jesus and his capacity to bring about healing. So we're going to stop here tonight, and then we'll pick up next week with an interesting story about Jesus' inability to bring about healing. The question, of course, is why is it that Jesus is not able to heal? Now, as we look at the Gospel of Mark up to this point, into the 8th chapter, we see time and again that the disciples just don't understand who Jesus is. We want to say, my gosh, you have seen all of this and heard all of this. How are you that stupid? And I would say that there are times in my own life where I've seen the miraculous in just everyday life, and I've heard God speak through events, people, circumstances, etc., and I miss it. I don't have the faith oftentimes to see it for what it is. We are like the disciples here, and I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that one of the things Mark does is portray the disciples oftentimes as almost buffoon-like, so stupid, so lacking in faith. And I oftentimes find myself in the same position where I think, in retrospect, looking back, it has been obvious to me that God was in the midst of that, but in the moment, I just didn't get it. Jesus says it's because we don't have the eyes to see and the ears to hear sometimes. We don't have the faith to see or the ears hear how it is God comes to us. So next week, we're going to look at a fascinating story about the toll this takes on Jesus. Once again, I want to thank you for being a part of Bible study. I'm certainly grateful that you would choose to be with me tonight as we go through this study. Blessings to you.